Hello and welcome. Today's story is based on real events and a real person. We're going to talk about a man named Clark Olofsson. He was a famous criminal, and his actions helped create the term, Stockholm Syndrome. This phrase is now used all over the world, not just in psychology, but also in politics and media. Recently, Clark Olofsson passed away, and this story is a way to look back at what happened and why it still matters today. This is also a great chance to improve your English. As you listen to the story, try to follow along carefully. You can repeat the sentences out loud to practice your speaking. Don't worry if you don't understand every word at first. The important thing is to keep going and let the language become more familiar. Let's get started. Clark Olofsson, the criminal who gave rise to the term Stockholm Syndrome, has died. This term is used in psychology and also often in political discussions. Here's the full story. Clark Olofsson died at the age of 78 in the town of Arvika in Sweden. He spent a big part of his life in prison. The last time he was released was in 2018, after serving a sentence in Belgium for drug smuggling. He became world famous on August 23, 1973. His former cellmate, Jan-Erik Olsson, tried to rob a branch of Creditbanken located on Norrmalmstorg Square in Stockholm. During the robbery, Olsson took 4 hostages and demanded that the police bring Olofsson from prison to the bank. The two of them held the hostages together for 6 days. The way the hostages acted during and after the crisis gave birth to the term, Stockholm Syndrome. Experts still argue whether Stockholm Syndrome is a real diagnosis or just a psychological reaction. But it definitely exists as a political phrase. When people support restrictions on their own rights, vote for leaders who fail them, or follow the demands of a loud minority, someone will probably say, that's Stockholm Syndrome. Originally, there was nothing political about the idea. Olsson and Olofsson were just regular criminals. The event at Creditbanken was a robbery, not a terrorist attack. They wanted money, not to scare the Swedish government or the public. They had no big mission or idea they were ready to kill or die for. During the 6 days they held the hostages, they allowed people to go outside if they had panic attacks or claustrophobia. They comforted those who had nightmares, let hostages call their families, and even gave support when calls didn't go through. At one point, the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, got involved. One of the hostages spoke to him on the phone and said she was not afraid of the criminals. She was more afraid that the police would provoke the criminals and someone might die. In the end, the police used tear gas. The criminals surrendered. Everyone came out alive, and no one was seriously hurt. Before leaving the bank, the hostages and the robbers hugged and shook hands. During the crisis, a psychiatrist named Nils Bejerot advised the police. To explain what seemed like strange behavior by the hostages, he used the term identification with the aggressor. This idea has been known to psychologists for a long time, at least since the 1930s, from the work of Sandor Ferenczi and Anna Freud. A special case of this idea, when a hostage feels sympathy for their captor, was what Bejerot called Norrmalmstorg syndrome. In other countries, where that name was too hard to say, it was quickly replaced with the more familiar term, Stockholm Syndrome. Bejerot never claimed to discover anything new. He never said it was a medical condition. From the start, Stockholm Syndrome was more like a metaphor than a real clinical term. The Norrmalmstorg robbery was one of the first crimes to be shown live on global television. Because of that, the metaphor spread fast. It soon replaced the more technical phrase, identification with the aggressor, in many situations. Since then, journalists have often brought up Stockholm Syndrome. For example, in the 1980s in Lebanon, Islamic militants kidnapped 2 Americans and 1 British man. After they were freed, these hostages said their kidnappers treated them well. But in reality, they had been kept in chains in solitary cells. Stockholm Syndrome is not an official diagnosis. There are no standard rules or symptoms that define it clearly. Some professionals even argue that it's just a kind of victim blaming. Instead of focusing on how the criminals control or manipulate their victims, the term blames the victims for reacting in an unusual way. Still, people often use the idea of Stockholm Syndrome when talking about women in abusive relationships. Some women face violence from their partners but are unable to leave them. It is believed that Stockholm Syndrome happens when a victim fears for their life and cannot protect themselves. Maybe the abuser has power, a weapon, or is simply stronger. The victim also cannot escape, maybe because they are locked up or have nowhere else to go. This reaction is not logical, but it does not mean it's completely irrational. Feeling love for the captor is sometimes the only hope the victim sees for staying safe in a hopeless situation. A bond might form if the abuser first threatens the victim and then decides not to hurt them. The victim feels relief. That relief can turn into a sense of thankfulness. If the abuser uses the victim as a tool to pressure others, as is often the case with hostages, then the victim might start fearing or even blaming the authorities who don't give in to the abuser's demands. Scientists continue to study this identification with the aggressor, in various situations. They look at hostages, prisoners of war, members of cults, victims of domestic violence, and sex workers. Some even describe what they call corporate Stockholm syndrome, when a boss mistreats an employee, but the employee still feels loyal or friendly toward the boss. Even so, when researchers use the term Stockholm syndrome, they usually mean it metaphorically, not as a medical fact. In 1989, an American businessman and political activist named Philip Pilevsky wrote a book called The Captive Continent. In it, he blamed the Soviet Union for creating tension between Western Europe and the United States. He said that the USSR scared Europeans so much that they started acting like hostages with Stockholm syndrome, slowly leaning towards Soviet positions. In that case, the metaphor was somewhat accurate. There was a source of fear. There were victims who had no way out. At least, that's a simplified way to see Europe's relationship with the USSR. And there was a political strategy focused on survival in a hard situation. The problem is, this metaphor is often not used carefully. In 2009, American political scientist Alex Shulman wrote that European politicians had become hostages to radical Islam and had Stockholm syndrome. For him, the aggressors they couldn't escape from were Muslim migrant communities living in Europe. That description does not match the reality of those communities at all. In 2015, Australian journalist Peter Brent said that fear of loud conservative groups kept the Labour Party from supporting same-sex marriage. He called this Stockholm syndrome too. In that case, the aggressors were the voters, again, an unfair use of the term. In 2014, people used the term to explain why Western countries reacted softly to Russia taking Crimea. The idea was that the West was dependent on Russia for energy, so they ignored its aggressive actions. In 2023, Russian state media and military bloggers said that Germany was following an anti-Russian policy only because the United States was holding it hostage, and that Germany had Stockholm syndrome. People especially like to use Stockholm syndrome to explain why citizens support a dictator. For example, many have said this about Russians and their support for Vladimir Putin. Those who say this believe that in a normal society, if people don't like something, they protest. And if they are not protesting, it means they agree with what's happening. But can it really be true that Russian citizens enjoy war against a neighboring country and political oppression inside their own country? That's where the idea of Stockholm syndrome comes in. It suggests that people are afraid of their government, and with good reason, they are not ready to fight it, and they have no way to escape. So, they choose to love Putin no matter what he does. Writers and especially public thinkers often try to use psychological ideas to explain political behavior. But usually this doesn't work very well. In 2012, a study was published that looked at how the term Stockholm syndrome is used in political and social discussions. The study found that the term rarely helps people understand or discuss issues better. Instead, it is often used as a label to say that someone's behavior is unhealthy, even though, once again, Stockholm syndrome is not officially recognized as a mental illness. If a behavior is just called wrong or sick, then the conversation can't really move forward. Politicians can use this kind of medical language to avoid having to deal with criticism. They say that people who disagree with them are not thinking clearly, but are showing signs of illness. That way, they don't need to answer any real arguments. On social media, calling someone's view a syndrome is a quick way to feel superior. The person who first accuses the other of not thinking straight or not seeing things clearly often feels like they have won the argument, just by using that label. It's very hard to study how common Stockholm syndrome really is. By the end of the 20th century, the FBI had estimated that in hostage situations involving terrorism, signs of Stockholm syndrome showed up in fewer than 10% of hostages. A full case of Stockholm syndrome, where the hostage truly bonds with the captor, is very rare. So the idea that more than 100 million Russians have all become hostages in love with their captor just doesn't make sense, if we take the term literally as a psychological diagnosis. But we already agreed that we're talking about a metaphor. So maybe we can imagine that Russia is like a single person, collective personality, who has been taken hostage and developed the syndrome. This brings up an interesting question. If Russia is a single person, does that person carry full responsibility for what the country does? For example, is it responsible for the war in Ukraine? There are real cases where people with Stockholm syndrome went from being victims to being part of the crime. One of the most famous examples is Patty Hearst. She was a young American woman from a very rich family. In 1974, she was kidnapped by a far-left militant group. They kept her locked in a small closet, raped her, and beat her. After some time, she joined the group and even helped them rob a bank. When she was arrested, doctors said she had severe post-traumatic stress, caused by fear, helplessness, and terror. But most people simply said she had Stockholm syndrome. Hearst was sentenced to 7 years in prison. She served 2, the rest of her sentence was delayed, and later she was pardoned by President Bill Clinton. He was convinced that she hadn't acted by her own free will. So here's the question, could we metaphorically think of over 100 million Russians as a kind of collective Patty Hearst? Either they understand what's going on and deserve punishment, or they are unable to help themselves or see their situation clearly. In that case, they need treatment and strict control. This kind of thinking was used by the people at the Potsdam Conference after World War II. They were trying to decide how to deal with Nazi Germany. That's when they came up with ideas like denazification and demilitarization. But it soon became clear that you can't send an entire country to therapy, especially not by force. West Germany changed through democracy and an economic miracle, not because of the angry plans of the Allied powers. So metaphors, even psychological ones, are not always bad. But they are not very helpful when it comes to finding real political solutions. There are many different syndromes that are named after cities or countries. For example, the exact opposite of Stockholm syndrome is called London syndrome. This is when a hostage refuses to cooperate with the captors at all and shows strong resistance. Then there's Lima syndrome, which got its name from the capital of Peru. It describes a situation where terrorists or kidnappers start to care about their hostages and treat them kindly. It's the reverse of Stockholm syndrome. Some place-named syndromes describe how tourists react to culture shock in foreign countries. One example is Florence syndrome. This is when people feel overwhelmed and confused after seeing too much art, especially in museums, as often happens in Florence, Italy. Jerusalem syndrome describes people who visit the city and suddenly feel that they are chosen by God or start preaching on the streets. It's a sudden and intense religious experience. India syndrome is about travelers who visit India and believe they have reached spiritual enlightenment. They may think they've discovered a higher truth or special knowledge that others don't understand. Paris syndrome happens to some visitors who have very high hopes about Paris, especially about its beauty and culture, and then feel disappointed when the real city doesn't match their dreams. This syndrome has been seen especially in tourists from Japan. There is also Sarajevo syndrome. This refers to psychological trauma experienced by people after the wars in the former Yugoslavia. It is basically a specific kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In nuclear science, there's a term called China syndrome. This is not a real medical condition, but a theoretical idea. It describes a worst-case nuclear power plant accident, where the reactor melts down and the radioactive fuel burns through the base of the building and deep into the ground. The name came from a joke that the melted material could go all the way to China if it kept going. These geographical syndromes show how we often use places as symbols for complex emotions or reactions. They are mostly metaphors, not official medical terms. But they help people talk about unusual experiences, especially when those experiences are hard to explain in other ways.